Amara Cole never expected a dangerous quest for the truth to rewrite her destiny or place her at the mercy of the most lethal shadow in Seoul. In a rain-slicked alleyway hidden from the city's neon glow, she faced what every other journalist had died trying to uncover: the barrel of a silencer held by a man with ice in his veins. She stood trembling, her back pressed against the cold brick as the storm thundered above. Her executioner, Baek Mu-Won, the immaculate Mafia enforcer whose very name was a death sentence, watched her with eyes that had never known hesitation. When Amara closed her eyes and waited for the end, the world went silent. She didn't know he had never failed a contract in 10 years. She didn't know she was the first person to ever look at the man behind the monster rather than the weapon in his hand. But when Mu-Won lowered his gun and draped his heavy, ink-stained coat over her shivering shoulders, something inside the syndicate's heart of stone cracked and realigned entirely around her. Hi besties, welcome to Mafia's Secret Love Stories. Please drop a comment, like, share, and subscribe. Let's begin with the story. The neon signs of Seoul's financial district usually looked like art, but tonight, they felt like eyes. 48 hours before she found herself staring into the abyss of a silencer, Amara Cole sat in the dim glow of her dual monitors, the air in her small office thick with the scent of lukewarm coffee and old paper. She was an investigative journalist who lived for the click, that precise, visceral moment when two disparate pieces of data finally snapped together to reveal a lie. The Phoenix Ledger didn't look like a weapon. It was a digital ghost, a series of encrypted spreadsheets she had spent 6 months hunting through the dark web and back alley tips. To a casual observer, it was just a list of shipping manifests for a logistics company. But Amara saw the patterns. She saw how millions of dollars evaporated in Busan and reappeared in offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, always leaving behind a faint, charred trail that led back to one name: the Phoenix Syndicate. Her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs as she cross-referenced the last set of coordinates. "Got you," she whispered, the sound unnervingly loud in the quiet room. She had found it. The bridge between the criminal underworld and the city's legitimate political elite. It was a scandal that would set the country on fire, but more importantly, it was the truth. The victory was short-lived. A sudden, sharp chill swept through the room, though the windows were closed. Amara leaned back, her neck stiff, and looked toward the glass partition of her office. The newsroom was empty, the cleaning crew having long since departed, but a shadow that didn't belong to the furniture stretched across the carpet. She told herself it was exhaustion. She told herself she was being paranoid. But as she packed her laptop, her hands were shaking. She took the stairs instead of the elevator, her heels clicking rhythmically on the concrete, a sound that felt like a countdown. When she stepped out onto the street, the late-night Seoul air was thick with humidity. She began to walk toward the subway station, her pace brisk, her eyes fixed forward. That was when she heard it. A car door closing 3 blocks away, perfectly timed with her movement. A pair of footsteps that stopped exactly 1 second after she did. She turned a corner, then another, weaving through the labyrinthine side streets near the Han River. Each time she looked back, she saw nothing but the blur of traffic and the glare of street lamps. Yet, the sensation of being watched was like a physical weight on her spine. It was a cold, calculated focus, the kind of attention a predator gives to a mark it has already decided to kill. Stopping at a convenience store under the pretense of buying water, she glanced into the security mirror above the door. In the reflection, she saw a black sedan idling at the curb. Through the tinted glass, she couldn't see a face, but she felt the presence of someone who wasn't just following her, but measuring her. Fear, sharp and metallic, tasted like copper in her mouth. She realized then that she hadn't just uncovered a ledger. She had signed her own death warrant. The Phoenix Syndicate didn't leave witnesses, and they certainly didn't let journalists tell stories. Amara ducked out of the store and broke into a run, her lungs burning, the rain beginning to fall in fat, heavy drops. She didn't head home. Home was a trap. She headed for the dense, crowded alleys of the Myeongdong district, hoping to lose herself in the shadows. But as the rain turned into a torrential downpour, blurring the world into a smear of gray and black. She realized the footsteps behind her hadn't faltered once. They were steady, precise, and closing in. She reached for her phone to call her editor, but her fingers were too slick with rain. She took a sharp left into a narrow passage, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The exit was blocked by a pile of discarded crates. She turned to retreat, but the silhouette of a man was already there, framing the entrance. He didn't speak. He didn't rush. He simply stepped into the light, his suit perfectly pressed despite the storm, his eyes as dark and unreadable as the ink that peeked out from beneath his cuffs. This was the end of the paper trail. The ledger was in her bag, but the enforcer was in front of her. And as Baek Mu-Won raised his hand, Amara finally understood that some truths were too heavy for one person to carry. The transition from the cold, rain-lashed alleyway to the sterile silence of the penthouse was a blur of trauma and morphine-thick exhaustion. When Amara finally opened her eyes, she didn't find the pearly gates or the hellfire she had expected. Instead, she found a ceiling of polished concrete and the soft, rhythmic hum of a high-end climate control system. She was lying on a bed that felt like a cloud, draped in silk sheets that cost more than her 6 months of back rent in Chicago. For a moment, she thought she was still dreaming, until she tried to sit up. A sharp, stinging protest from her shoulder anchored her back to reality. She wasn't dead, but she was a prisoner. The room was a masterclass in minimalist brutality. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of Seoul's skyline, the city lights shimmering like fallen stars, but the glass looked thick enough to withstand a blast. There were no personal photos, no books, and no clutter. Only the silent, expensive taste of a man who lived like a ghost. "You're awake." The voice was like velvet over gravel. Amara turned her head slowly to find Baek Mu-Won sitting in a leather armchair in the far corner of the room. He was still immaculately dressed, his white dress shirt crisp and buttoned to the throat, though his black jacket was draped over the chair's arm. He was cleaning a small, silver pocket knife with a microfiber cloth, his movements precise and hypnotic. "Where am I?" Amara's voice was a dry rasp. She reached for her throat, noticing for the first time that her rain-soaked clothes had been replaced with a soft, oversized charcoal robe. Her heart plummeted. "A place where the Phoenix Syndicate cannot find you," Mu-Won replied, not looking up from his task. "And a place where you cannot leave." He stood up, his tall, lean frame casting a long shadow across the room. As he walked toward her, the light caught the dark ink of the dragon tail curling around his neck, disappearing beneath his collar. He didn't look like a savior. He looked like a predator who had decided to keep his prey for himself. He stopped at the edge of the bed and reached out. Amara flinched, pulling the silk covers to her chin, but he didn't strike. Instead, he placed a glass of water and a small white pill on the nightstand. His fingers were long and steady, the skin over his knuckles scarred but clean. "I saw the ledger," he said, his dark eyes finally meeting hers. They were cold, yet there was a strange, vibrating intensity behind them that made her breath hitch. "You were clever to find it. You were foolish to keep it." "It's the truth," Amara whispered, her journalistic defiance flickering back to life. "People need to know what your family is doing to this city." Mu-Won leaned down, his face inches from hers. She could smell the faint scent of sandalwood and expensive tobacco. "The people in this city prefer to sleep. My family ensures they never wake up if they get too curious. You should be a corpse in a Han River tributary right now, Amara Cole. Do you understand why you aren't?" "I don't know," she admitted, her gaze locked on his. "Why didn't you kill me?" A flicker of something, frustration, or perhaps a hunger he didn't want to acknowledge, passed over his sharp features. He reached out, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw with a touch so light it was almost a ghost. It was the first time she felt the fracture in his hardness. He was possessive, his hand lingering as if he were marking her. "Because for the first time in 10 years, I found something more interesting than a contract," he murmured. He straightened up, his emotional shield snapping back into place instantly. He walked toward the door, his gait fluid and lethal. "The doors are biometric. The windows are reinforced. My men are in the hall. You will stay here, you will eat, and you will wait. You are no longer a journalist, Amara. You are a ghost. And as long as you stay in this room, I am the only one who can see you." As the heavy door clicked shut with a sound of finality, Amara looked out at the sprawling city. She was safe from the syndicate, but she was trapped with the man sent to end her. This safe house was a golden cage, and as she looked at the water he had left her, she realized with a terrifying jolt that she wasn't just afraid of the man who had saved her. She was drawn to the darkness he carried. The silence of the penthouse was not the empty kind. It was heavy, filled with the unspoken weight of things Mu-Won refused to say and the questions Amara was too terrified to ask. 3 days had passed in that high-altitude cage. Amara had learned the rhythm of his shadow, the way he appeared at dawn with coffee he never drank, and the way he vanished into the dark office at the end of the hall, emerging only when the city below had gone quiet. On the 4th night, the silence broke. Amara was in the kitchen, nursing a glass of wine she didn't want, when she heard a heavy thud from the living area. She found Mu-Won slumped on the low-profile Italian sofa, his jacket discarded on the floor. His white shirt was unbuttoned halfway, stained with a dark, spreading crimson that looked like ink in the moonlight. "You're bleeding," she breathed, her journalistic instinct to observe momentarily eclipsed by a raw, human panic. "It's a graze," he muttered, his voice tighter than usual. He tried to pull his shirt off, but his shoulder hitched, his face contorting into a mask of cold pain. "Let me," Amara said. It wasn't a request. She stepped into his space, her heart hammering against her ribs. For the first time, he didn't stop her. He leaned his head back against the leather, eyes closing as she carefully peeled the blood-soaked fabric away from his skin. As the shirt fell away, the breath caught in Amara's throat. It wasn't just the wound, a shallow, ugly tear across his deltoid, that silenced her. It was his skin. In the dim light, Mu-Won's torso was a living tapestry of violence and beauty. A sprawling, intricate Irizumi-style dragon coiled around his ribs, its scales shimmering with dark blues and deep reds. But as she moved closer with a bowl of warm water and antiseptic, she saw what the ink was trying to hide. Beneath the dragon's belly and between the swirling clouds of the tattoo were jagged, raised lines of white scar tissue. They weren't from a surgeon's knife. They were the marks of a man who had been broken long before he had become the breaker of others. "Who did this to you?" she whispered, her fingers trembling as she dabbed at the fresh wound. Mu-Won opened his eyes. They were unfocused, glazed with a mixture of pain and something that looked dangerously like exhaustion. "The syndicate doesn't just hire you, Amara. They craft you. Every scar is a lesson I failed to learn the first time." He winced as the antiseptic stung, but he didn't pull away. Instead, his gaze dropped to her hands, watching her work. "That one on my chest," he pointed with a ghost of a gesture to a star-shaped puckering of skin near his heart, "was my father's final gift before he sold me to the chairman. He wanted to make sure I never forgot what happens to people who feel too much." Amara paused, her hand hovering over his heart. The Shadow Emperor of the Seoul underworld was nothing more than a collection of tragedies stitched together with expensive silk and dark ink. The ice she had feared since the alleyway didn't just feel cold anymore. It felt like a shield. "Is that why you didn't kill me?" she asked softly. "Because you recognized another lesson you weren't ready to learn?" Mu-Won reached up, his hand catching her wrist. His grip wasn't painful, but it was absolute. He pulled her hand closer until her palm was pressed flat against the dragon's head on his chest. Beneath the ink, his heart beat with a slow, heavy thud, a steady rhythm that felt like a secret meant only for her. "I didn't kill you because when I looked at you in that rain," he confessed, his voice dropping to a low, vulnerable frequency, "I didn't see a target. I saw the only thing in this city that wasn't a lie." The air between them shifted, the tension turning from fear into something thick and magnetic. Amara didn't pull away. She looked at the scars, then at the tattoos, and finally at the man whose hardness was visibly fracturing beneath her touch. She realized then that Mu-Won wasn't just her jailer. He was a man who had spent his whole life waiting for someone to look past the ink and see the wreckage underneath. You don't have to be their weapon anymore, she murmured. Mu-Won let out a short, hollow laugh that didn't reach his eyes. In my world, Amara, if you aren't the weapon, you're the target. And now, because of me, you're both. He leaned forward, his forehead coming to rest against hers. In that shared breath, the minimalist penthouse felt smaller, more intimate. The fractured ice had finally given way, revealing a depth of devotion that was as terrifying as it was beautiful. For the first time since the ledger, Amara wasn't thinking about the story. She was thinking about the man who had traded his soul to keep her breathing. The fragile piece of the penthouse shattered at 3 a.m. with the low, insistent vibration of a burner phone. Mu-Won didn't have to answer it for Amara to know who was on the other end. The air in the room instantly turned frigid, the Shadow Emperor retreating behind a mask of glass and steel. Chairman Yu, the patriarch of the Phoenix Syndicate, wanted his proof. He wanted the head of the woman who had seen too much. He doesn't believe I've done it yet, Mu-Won said, his voice a ghost of the vulnerability he had shown her only hours before. He stood by the window, his silhouette cutting a sharp, lethal line against the city lights. He sent a cleaner to verify the site. If there is no body, if there is no blood, they will come for me. And then they will find you. Amara stood in the doorway, the oversized robe swallowed by the shadows. What do? We give them what they want, he replied, turning to look at her. His eyes were dark, swirling with a desperate, calculating hunger. We kill Amara Cole. The preparation was a clinical nightmare. Mu-Won moved with a terrifying efficiency, pulling a specialized kit from a hidden floor safe. He laid out vials of synthetic, iron-scented stage blood, a high-velocity air compressor, and a mangled piece of clothing that matched the blouse Amara had worn in the alley. To anyone else, it looked like movie magic. To Mu-Won, it was the only way to keep her breathing. They drove in silence to a derelict shipyard on the outskirts of Incheon, a place where the salt air tasted like rust and secrets. The rain had returned, a gray shroud that muffled the world. Mu-Won led her to a concrete pier, the black water of the yellow sea churning below like an open grave. Listen to me, he whispered, his hands steady as he began to splash the dark crimson liquid across the concrete. When the car pulls up, you need to be out of sight, beneath the pier. I have secured a harness. You will wait in the dark, in the cold, and you will not make a sound. No matter what you hear, no matter how much I scream. Amara looked at the crime scene he was meticulously crafting. He was painting a portrait of her death with the practiced hand of a man who had seen it 1,000 times. He took a heavy stone and smashed a pair of her spare glasses, scattering the shards across the blood. It was horrific, a visceral, silent scream of a life cut short. Mu-Won, she grabbed his forearm, her fingers digging into the expensive wool of his coat. If they catch you lying. They won't, he cut her off, his voice dropping to a fierce, possessive growl. He stepped close, cupping her face in his hands. His thumbs traced her cheekbones one last time before the shadow took over completely. To the world, you are dead. To the chairman, you are a problem solved. You exist only for me now. Do you understand? She nodded, tears blurring her vision as he helped her lower herself into the freezing, barnacle-encrusted shadows beneath the pier. The harness bit into her skin, but she welcomed the pain. It was the only thing that felt real. From her hiding spot, she heard the crunch of gravel. A second car had arrived. She heard the heavy thud of footsteps, the cleaner sent to verify the kill. Then, she heard Mu-Won's voice. It was a sound she didn't recognize, cold, bored, and utterly devoid of mercy. He spoke of her like she was trash he had finally disposed of, his laughter a jagged blade in the dark. Then came the flash. The cleaner was taking photos. Amara squeezed her eyes shut, her body trembling as she heard the sound of a heavy object being dragged across the concrete and dumped into the water. Splash. The sound of her own ghost hitting the waves. It's done. The stranger's voice drifted down to her, oily and satisfied. The chairman will be pleased, Mu-Won. You're still the best we have. The cars roared to life and retreated, leaving behind only the sound of the tide. When Mu-Won finally reached down to pull her back up, his face was deathly pale, his hands shaking for the first time in his life. He hauled her onto the pier and crushed her against his chest, burying his face in her hair. Amara looked down at the blood-stained concrete, at the shattered remains of her old life. On paper, she was a corpse. In the eyes of the law, she had vanished. She was a woman without a name, tethered to a man who had just lied to the most dangerous people on earth to keep her. The fake execution was complete, but as they drove back toward the city, Amara realized the truth. The journalist was dead, and the woman who loved a monster had truly been born. The penthouse felt smaller after the shipyard, the air charged with the static of a secret that only the two of them carried. For Amara, the world outside the reinforced glass had ceased to exist. She was a ghost dwelling in a fortress of marble and shadow, and the only thing that felt solid, the only thing that felt alive, was the man who had supposedly killed her. The fake execution had stripped away the last of their formalities. Mu-Won no longer retreated to his office for hours on end. He was always there, a silent, prowling presence in the periphery of her vision. His controlled focus, once his greatest weapon as an enforcer, had pivoted. He wasn't watching for threats anymore. He was watching her. The way she tucked her hair behind her ear when she was anxious, the way her pulse fluttered at the base of her throat when he entered the room. The heat broke on a Tuesday night when the city was obscured by a thick, milky fog. Amara was standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, tracing the reflection of a man she no longer recognized as herself. She felt him behind her before she heard him. The scent of sandalwood and rain-drenched wool preceded him, a sensory warning that the predatory calm he usually maintained was beginning to fray. "You should be sleeping," Mu-Won murmured. He didn't move away. He stood so close that the heat radiating from his body seeped through the thin silk of her robe. "I can't," Amara replied, her voice barely a whisper. She turned around, her back pressing against the cold glass, trapped between the frozen city and the burning man. "Every time I close my eyes, I hear the splash of that rock in the water. I feel the cold beneath the pier. I keep waiting for the moment I actually die." Mu-Won's jaw tightened, a muscle leaping in his cheek. He reached out, his hand hovering near her face before his fingers finally dove into the hair at her temple. His touch was heavy, possessive, and desperately grounded. "You are not going to die. I have lied to the gods of this city for you. I have burned my reputation to ash to keep you breathing." "Why?" Amara asked, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She reached up, her fingers brushing the ink of the dragon on his neck. "You said I was just an interesting contract. But you don't risk your life for a contract, Mu-Won. You risk it for something else." The silence that followed was suffocating. Mu-Won's dark eyes searched hers, the ice within them finally shattering into 1,000 shards of raw, unfiltered hunger. The professional distance he had cultivated for a decade collapsed in a single heartbeat. "Because I can't look away," he growled, his voice dropping into a register of pure, lethal devotion. "Because every time I try to imagine a world where you don't exist, the air leaves my lungs. You were meant to be my end, Amara, but you've become the only reason I want to stay." He didn't wait for her to respond. He leaned in, his mouth crashing against hers with a desperate intensity that tasted of wine, tobacco, and long-denied longing. It wasn't a gentle kiss, it was a claim. It was the collision of a man who had never been allowed to want and a woman who had never been truly seen. Amara gasped into the kiss, her hands sliding up his chest to grip the lapels of his shirt, pulling him closer until there was no space left between them. The forbidden heat they had been dancing around for weeks finally consumed them. Mu-Won's hands were everywhere, one tangled in her hair, the other pressing into the small of her back, pinning her to the window as if he were afraid she would dissolve into the fog if he let go for even a second. His kiss moved to the sensitive skin beneath her ear, his breath hot against her skin. "You are mine," he whispered against her pulse, the words more of a vow than a statement. "The syndicate thinks you're dead. The law thinks you're gone. You belong to the shadows now. You belong to me." In that moment, Amara knew she should be afraid. She was a prisoner of the city's most dangerous man, caught in a web of lies that could end in a bloodbath. But as Mu-Won pulled her back into the kiss, his possessive grip anchoring her to the earth, she didn't feel like a victim. She felt like she had finally found the one place where she was truly safe, right in the center of the storm he had created for her. The journalist was gone. Only the woman remained, falling deeper into a love that was never meant to survive the light of day. The golden safety of the penthouse felt thinner the next morning, as if the walls themselves were beginning to sweat. For Amara, the memory of Mu-Won's touch still hummed beneath her skin, a secret heat that contrasted with the sudden, sharp drop in the apartment's temperature. Mu-Won was back in his suit, the buttons done up to his chin, his face once again a mask of marble. But the mask was cracked. He stood at the center of the living room, staring at his tablet with a stillness that Amara had learned to recognize as a precursor to violence. "What is it?" she asked, stepping into the light. Mu-Won didn't look up. "There is a leak. Not from the ledger, but from the shipyard." The traitor's shadow had a name, Kong Ho-suk. He was Mu-Won's shadow within the syndicate, a rival enforcer who had spent years waiting for the Shadow Emperor to stumble. Ho-suk was a man of jagged edges and boundless ambition, and unlike the cleaner who had been satisfied by a few photos of blood on concrete, Ho-suk had gone back to the pier after the sun rose. He hadn't found a body, but he had found something worse, a single, overlooked thread of silk from Amara's robe, snagged on a barnacle beneath the wood. Ho-suk hadn't gone to the chairman yet. He was playing a different game, the game of leverage. He knew that a dead journalist was a job well done, but a live journalist was a leash around Mu-Won's neck. "He sent me a file," Mu-Won said, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly low frequency. He turned the screen toward her. It was a high-resolution photo taken through a long-range lens. It showed Amara's silhouette against the penthouse window from the night before, a ghost caught in a frame of light. "He's been watching the building from the adjacent tower. He knows you aren't a corpse in the Han River." Panic, cold and suffocating, surged in Amara's chest. The realization that their most intimate moment had been witnessed by a man who traded in blood made her feel exposed, as if the reinforced glass had been stripped away. "If he tells the chairman." "He won't tell him." "Not yet," Mu-Won interrupted, his hand finding the grip of the handgun tucked into his waistband. "If he tells the chairman, I am executed, and you are killed. But if he keeps the secret, he can force me to do his dirty work. He wants to use me to assassinate the rivals he's too weak to face. He wants to turn the Shadow Emperor into his personal puppet." The hunt had moved inside the syndicate. It was no longer a war of ledgers and journalists. It was a civil war of shadows. The very structure that Mu-Won had served his entire life was now a maze of traps, and Ho-suk was closing the exits one by one. "We have to move," Mu-Won commanded. He didn't ask her this time. He grabbed a tactical bag and began sweeping her few belongings into it. "Move where? You said this was the safest place in Seoul." "It was, until the devil started looking through the windows," he growled. He stopped, his possessive nature flaring as he grabbed her by the shoulders. His eyes were no longer cold, they were desperate. "Ho-suk is a hunter, Amara. He doesn't just want you dead. He wants to watch me break while I try to save you. He's already alerted his personal unit. They aren't syndicate men. They're mercenaries who answer only to him." As if on cue, the lights in the penthouse flickered once, then died. The backup generators hummed for a second before they, too, were cut. The sprawling view of Seoul stayed bright, but the fortress was now in darkness. The biometric locks on the doors let out a long, pathetic whine as the power was diverted. "They're in the building," Mu-Won whispered, the sound of his suppressed weapon clicking into place echoing in the dark. He pulled Amara behind him, his body a human shield. He's not waiting for an answer. He's coming to collect his leverage. The silence that followed was broken by the muffled thwip-thwip of suppressed gunfire from the hallway. Mu-Won didn't flinch. He leaned in, his lips brushing Amara's forehead in a gesture that felt like both a goodbye and a promise. "Keep your head down and stay on my heels," he ordered. "The man who was meant to kill you is the only thing standing between you and the men who actually will. Don't let go of my coat, Amara. Not for a second." They stepped into the blackness of the corridor, leaving the golden cage behind. The hunt had begun, and the shadows were no longer on their side. The descent from the penthouse was no longer a retreat, it was a war. The emergency stairwell was a vertical tunnel of concrete and shadows, vibrating with the muffled rhythm of boots climbing from below. Mu-Won moved with a terrifying, liquid grace, his body positioned perpetually between Amara and the darkness. Every few floors, he would pause, his head tilted as he tracked the movement of Hosuk's mercenaries through the building's skeletal structure. "They're cutting off the lobby," Mu-Won whispered, the green glow of the exit sign casting a ghoulish light over his sharp features. "We're going to the service garage. Keep your breathing shallow. If you see a flash, shut your eyes." They burst through the heavy fire door into the subterranean dampness of the garage. The air smelled of gasoline and wet concrete. Before Amara could process the silence, the space erupted. A hail of suppressed gunfire chewed through the bodywork of a parked luxury SUV near them, shattering glass into a diamond rain that pelted Amara's skin. Mu-Won didn't hesitate. He leaned around the concrete pillar, his own weapon barking 3 precise times. The Shadow Emperor was no longer the man who had shared wine with her in the moonlight. He was a machine of lethal intent. He reached back, his hand finding Amara's, his grip a crushing anchor. "Run, now!" They sprinted through the maze of pillars as more mercenaries emerged from the shadows. Mu-Won was a whirlwind of violence, firing with one hand while shielding Amara with his own body. He moved with a cold focus that felt superhuman, calculating angles and trajectories in the heat of the siege. When a gunman lunged from behind a concrete pylon, Mu-Won didn't even break stride. He used the momentum of his run to drive a knee into the man's chest, the sound of breaking ribs echoing through the hollow garage before he finished him with a single, clinical shot. They reached a nondescript, armored black sedan tucked in a corner bay. Mu-Won threw Amara into the passenger seat and vaulted over the hood as bullets sparked off the reinforced roof. The engine roared to life with a primal snarl, and they tore out of the garage, the tires screaming against the epoxy floor. The city of Seoul, usually a playground of neon and light, had become a gauntlet. As they hit the rain-slicked streets, 2 gray sedans swerved out of the shadows to flank them. This was the syndicate's reach, a terrifying, invisible net closing in. Mu-Won drove with a hand on the wheel and a hand on his gun, weaving through the late-night traffic of Gangnam with suicidal precision. "Mu-Won, look out!" Amara screamed as one of the chase cars rammed their rear bumper, sending the armored sedan into a precarious fishtail. Mu-Won didn't flinch. He corrected the slide with a violent jerk of the wheel, his jaw set in a line of iron. "Hold on to the seat," he commanded. He slammed on the brakes, causing the following car to overshoot them. In the split second of overlap, Mu-Won fired through his own passenger window, the bullet punching through the rival driver's glass. The gray sedan veered wildly, crashing into a row of parked scooters in a spectacular spray of sparks and debris. But the siege wasn't over. As they approached the Mapo Bridge, a blockade of black vans moved to seal the exit. The shadows were everywhere. "They won't let us cross," Amara gasped, her eyes wide as she saw the flash of rifles being leveled at them. "I didn't ask for their permission," Mu-Won growled. Instead of slowing, he floored the accelerator. The car surged forward, a bulletproof battering ram. He looked at Amara for a fleeting second, his possessive gaze burning with a fierce, protective fire. "Close your eyes, Amara. I've got you." The impact was a bone-jarring symphony of twisting metal and shattering safety glass. The armored sedan plowed through the gap between the vans, the force of the collision throwing Amara against her harness. They soared onto the bridge, the dark waters of the Han River churning below them. For a moment, they were airborne, suspended between the life they knew and the uncertain darkness ahead. When the wheels hit the pavement again, they didn't stop. Mu-Won pushed the car to its absolute limit, the engine screaming as they left the city lights behind. The silence that followed was heavy with the smell of burnt rubber and adrenaline. Amara looked at Mu-Won. His shirt was torn, his knuckles were bloodied, and his eyes were fixed on the horizon. He had fought the entire city to keep her, and as the dawn began to break over the outskirts of Seoul, she realized the siege hadn't just been against the syndicate. It had been the final death of the man he used to be. The safe house on the outskirts of Gyeonggi was a far cry from the glass and steel luxury of the penthouse. It was a low-slung, concrete bunker hidden beneath a dilapidated warehouse, smelling of damp earth and stale grease. Here, the adrenaline that had fueled their escape finally curdled into a cold, hollow dread. Mu-Won sat at a rusted metal table, his hands steady as he loaded a fresh magazine into his sidearm, but his skin was the color of ash. "They won't stop," he said, his voice a low vibration that seemed to come from the floorboards. "Ho-suk has already lost face. He'll burn the city down to prove he can still finish what I couldn't." Amara sat across from him, her laptop open, the Phoenix ledger glowing on the screen like a digital ticking clock. "We have the evidence, Mu-Won. If I hit send, the chairman, Ho-suk, the politicians, they all go down. We don't have to run anymore." Mu-Won looked up, his dark eyes softening for the briefest of seconds. He reached across the table, his thumb tracing the line of her knuckles. "If you hit send, you become the most hunted woman in Asia. I won't let you pay that price." Before she could argue, the perimeter alarm let out a high-pitched, electronic shriek. The price of devotion was called due in an instant. Mu-Won was on his feet, his weapon leveled at the reinforced door. "Get in the crawl space," he ordered, his voice shifting back into the cold, lethal command of the Shadow Emperor. "Now, Amara." The breach was deafening. The door didn't just open. It disintegrated under the force of a tactical charge. Smoke and concussive sound filled the small room. Amara scrambled into the darkness of the hidden compartment behind the wall, her fingers clutching the laptop to her chest. Through the narrow slats of the vent, she watched the man who had saved her life become a god of war. Mu-Won moved with a terrifying, jagged beauty. He took down the first 3 mercenaries before they could clear the doorway, his movements a blur of ink and steel. But there were too many. Ho-suk himself stepped through the haze, flanked by a dozen men. He didn't fire. He watched with a sick, twisted smile as his men swarmed Mu-Won. Even as they pinned him to the floor, even as a rifle but slammed into his ribs, Mu-Won's eyes never left the wall where Amara was hidden. He didn't struggle. He went still, offering himself up as a sacrificial lamb to keep their attention away from the shadows. "Where is she, Mu-Won?" Ho-suk's voice was like oil on water. He kicked Mu-Won in the temple, a sickening thud that made Amara scream silently behind her hands. "Tell me where the girl is, and I'll make your execution quick." Mu-Won spat blood onto Ho-suk's polished shoes and grinned, a jagged, terrifying expression. "She's a ghost, Ho-suk, and ghosts have a habit of haunting people like you." As they dragged Mu-Won out into the night, his body limp and broken, Amara felt the world tilt. She was alone in the dark, the man she loved captured by monsters. But as the sound of the engines faded, her terror transformed into a cold, sharp clarity. She was a journalist. She didn't have a gun, but she had something more powerful, the truth. She crawled out of the space, her hands shaking as she opened the ledger. She didn't just have names, she had timestamps, bank accounts, and photos of the very men who had just taken Mu-Won. Her fingers flew across the keys. She wasn't just leaking a file, she was orchestrating a symphony of chaos. She began sending the data in fragments, not to the police, who were bought and paid for, but to every rival news agency, every international watchdog, and every social media influencer in Seoul. She created a digital wildfire, tagging the chairman and Ho-suk in a narrative of betrayal and corruption that made them radioactive. Within minutes, the Phoenix Ledger was the only thing the world was talking about. The distraction worked with surgical precision. As the syndicate's servers went into meltdown and the chairman's legal team began to scramble, the internal security at the Phoenix headquarters fractured. Using the backdoors Mu-Won had shown her in the penthouse system, Amara tracked the GPS in Mu-Won's encrypted watch, a failsafe he had never told the syndicate about. She saw him. He was being held in a holding cell at the Incheon docks, the very place of her execution. The hunter had become the hunted. As the authorities, under intense public pressure, began to descend on the syndicate's known properties. Amara slipped out of the warehouse. She wasn't running away this time. She was heading toward the docks, armed with the chaos she had created. The price of his devotion had been his freedom, but the price of her love would be the total destruction of the world that had tried to tear them apart. The Incheon docks were a chaotic blur of strobe lights and sirens as the digital wildfire Amara had ignited finally reached the physical world. While the authorities swarmed the syndicate's main offices, distracted by the explosive evidence of the Phoenix Ledger, the pier remained a dark, jagged edge of the city. Amara found him in the same warehouse where she had almost lost her own life. Ho-suk had been too slow to realize the tide had turned. By the time he saw the news alerts on his men's phones, it was too late. The syndicate was no longer a shadow empire. It was a sinking ship. In a final, desperate act of vengeance, Ho-suk had raised his gun to finish Mu-Won, but he had underestimated the resilience of a man who finally had something to live for. When Amara burst through the doors, she didn't find a victim. She found Mu-Won standing over the fallen rival, his knuckles raw and his breathing heavy, his dark eyes instantly searching for her in the gloom. They didn't stay to watch the ruins burn. They left Seoul behind as the sunrise began to peel away the layers of corruption they had exposed. The Phoenix Syndicate was dismantled from the inside out, the ledger serving as the hammer that crushed the chairman's grip on the city. The Shadow Emperor and the journalist vanished into the haze of the morning, leaving behind only the ashes of the lives they used to lead. 8 months later, the air was different. It didn't taste of smog and secrets, but of salt spray and blooming orchids. In a quiet coastal village in New Zealand, far from the neon reach of the Seoul underworld, a small cottage sat nestled against a backdrop of emerald hills. The only syndicate here was the local fishermen's collective, and the only shadows were the ones cast by the sprawling trees in the garden. Amara sat on the wooden porch, the late afternoon sun warming her skin. She wasn't chasing leads anymore. She was writing a book, not a ledger of crimes, but a story of how some fractures are meant to be filled with light. Beside her, a half-finished cup of tea steamed in the breeze. The screen door creaked open, and Mu-Won stepped out. He wasn't wearing an immaculate suit or a concealed weapon. He wore a simple linen shirt, the sleeves rolled up to reveal the dragon ink that still coiled around his forearms, a permanent reminder of a past he had outrun. He looked younger, the lethal precision of his gaze softened by a peace he had never known was possible. He placed a hand on Amara's shoulder, his fingers lingering with that same possessive devotion that had once been her cage and was now her anchor. He leaned down, pressing a kiss to the crown of her head. "The orchids are blooming," he murmured, his voice no longer a gravelly warning but a gentle caress. Amara leaned back against him, closing her eyes. The man who had been meant to kill her had become the man she chose every single day. They were no longer ghosts or targets. They were simply two people who had survived the dark to find the dawn. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in strokes of violet and gold, the silence was no longer heavy or dangerous. It was a symphony of a new beginning. The enforcer had found his heart, and the journalist had found her truth. And in this quiet corner of the world, their story was no longer written in blood, but in the enduring rhythm of a love that had defied every ending. 5 years later, the orchids had expanded into a sprawling terrace of white and violet, a vibrant contrast to the rugged cliffs of the New Zealand coast. The quiet was no longer the silence of a man hiding from his past, but the peace of a father watching his future. Amara stood by the garden gate, watching the scene on the grass. Mu-Won was no longer the Shadow Emperor, who moved with lethal precision. He was a man being used as a human climbing frame. A 4-year-old boy with Amara's defiant eyes and Mu-Won's focused brow was currently perched on his father's shoulders, shrieking with laughter as they hunted imaginary dragons in the tall grass. "Be careful, Baek Mu-Won," Amara called out, a playful smirk tugging at her lips. "He has his father's grip. If he pulls your hair any harder, you'll be as bald as Chairman Yu." Mu-Won spun around, the child on his shoulders squealing in delight. He looked at Amara, and for a moment, the years of blood and ink seemed like a different lifetime entirely. The sharp, dangerous edges of his face had been smoothed by years of easy smiles and undisturbed sleep. "He's not a target, he's a force of nature," Mu-Won replied, his voice warm and grounded. He lowered the boy to the ground and watched him sprint toward a cluster of butterflies. Mu-Won walked over to Amara, his hands finding her waist with that same possessive instinct that had once been born in a rain-slicked Seoul alley. He leaned down, his forehead resting against hers. "I received a letter today," Amara whispered, leaning into his strength. "From Seoul. The Phoenix Ledger case is officially closed. The last of Ho-suk's associates were sentenced this morning. It's over, Mu-Won. All of it." Mu-Won didn't flinch at the names. They were just words now, hollow echoes of a story that had ended the moment he chose her. He pulled her closer, his thumb tracing the wedding band on her finger, the only contract he would ever honor again. "It was over the moment I gave you my coat in the rain," he murmured. Outside their garden, the Pacific Ocean stretched toward an infinite horizon. A world away, Seoul was still a city of millions, a place of neon and shadows and stories yet to be told. But here, on the edge of the world, the story of Amara Cole and Baek Mu-Won had reached its truest chapter. It was a story that had begun with a gun and a ledger, but it would end with a home and a legacy. Their love had been improbable, a collision of truth and violence that should have destroyed them both. Instead, it had created something enduring, a life built not on the secrets they kept, but on the truth they lived every day. As their son ran back to them, clutching a wilted orchid like a prize, Mu-Won scooped him up and reached for Amara's hand. They walked toward the house together, three silhouettes against the setting sun. Some stories are meant to be written in ink, and some in blood, but theirs was written in the quiet, golden light of a forever they had fought the whole world to earn.